walk into a grocery store, and pick up almost anything: a soda, a loaf of bread, a bottle of ketchup, a container of salad dressing, a tub of yogurt, a canister of baby formula. In a typical American supermarket, 3 out of every 4 products on the shelf contain a corn derivative, a sweetener, a starch, a thickener, a coating, a pharmaceutical substrate. Corn in your medicine tablets, corn in the adhesive on your envelopes, corn in the fuel in your gas tank, corn in the invisible film that keeps produce looking fresh in the refrigerated aisle. Not corn you can see or taste. Corn that has been industrially transformed into 40 different ingredients, traveling under names like dextrose, maltodextrin, xanthan gum, and citric acid, none of which say corn anywhere on the label. The most powerful crop in human history produced 1.23 billion metric tons in the 2023 to 2024 growing season. The United States alone plants more than 86 million acres a year, an area larger than the state of Montana. By total weight, corn outproduces wheat and rice combined. It is the largest crop on Earth, and it began as a wild grass no one could eat. 9,000 years ago, the ancestor of this grain grew along a river valley in what is now southern Mexico. Its ears were smaller than a finger. Its kernels were sealed inside a casing made of silica and lignin, so dense that if you swallowed the grain whole, it passed through your body entirely intact. It was not food. It was not recognizably the ancestor of anything that mattered. It was always there. You just didn't see it. That is the story of corn, how a wild grass became the invisible backbone of modern civilization. What people missed along the way, what that cost them, and what they eventually built once they finally paid attention. It is a story about food, about a disease that killed more than 100,000 Americans, and about a discovery hidden in a barrel of industrial waste in Peoria, Illinois, that changed medicine forever. To understand it, you have to go back to that valley and to a mutation in a single gene. The Balsas River Valley cuts through the highlands of south-central Mexico, dry and thorny and fierce with heat. 9,000 years ago, a wild grass grew there that botanists call teosinte. If you found it in the wild today, you would not recognize it. Its cob was the size of a thumbnail, bearing 5 or 6 kernels in a single row. Each kernel was sealed inside its own fruit case, a shell made of silica and lignin so hard and dense it was functionally impenetrable, not just hard to crack, indigestible. The fruit case resisted the stomach entirely. Swallowed whole, it came out unchanged. What the people of the Balsas Valley found first was not the grain, but the stalk. Chewed, it yields a faint sweetness, not unlike sugarcane. The archaeological evidence suggests they consumed the stalk long before they worked out what to do with the kernels. The grain, in its original state, was nearly useless. Then a mutation appeared in a single plant. A change in a gene now called teosinte gloom. Architecture. One softened the fruit case. Slightly. Just enough. Somewhere in the Balsas Valley, someone ground those softened kernels between 2 stones and found something edible underneath. And whoever it was, they saved those seeds. They planted them the following spring. And over generations that became centuries, that became millennia, they kept selecting the plants with the softer casings, the longer cobs, the ears that did not shatter at harvest and scatter their seeds to the soil. This is not a story with a single inventor or a famous date. It is a collective act of human patience across 4,000 years. Geneticists publishing in 2023, analyzing the genomes of more than 1,000 ancient and modern samples, confirmed that all corn on Earth today descends from a hybrid formed around 5,000 years ago. when that early domesticated lowland grass crossed with a second wild Teosine species in the Mexican highlands. The combination unlocked traits that let the plant grow in colder terrain, at higher elevation. That was when it began to spread. Corn cannot reproduce without human intervention. Its husks bind the kernels so tightly that without a hand to open them and scatter the seeds, the plant dies. The farmers who created it made something that permanently needed them. In return, it would feed their civilizations for millennia. The physical transformation is almost impossible to absorb. A teosinte ear held beside a modern corn cob looks like a matchstick held beside a torch. Whatever those unnamed people in the Balsas Valley saw in that unremarkable weed, they saw it clearly enough to spend 40 centuries pulling it towards something the rest of the world could use. By the time the great civilizations of Mesoamerica rose, the transformation was complete. Corn did not merely sustain them, it became who they were. The Maya built their ceremonial calendar around the time corn takes to mature. The Aztecs extracted corn as tribute from subjugated peoples and stored it in state granaries as the foundation of imperial power. The Inca cut thousands of storage chambers into Andean rock to protect their harvest through drought. These were not incidental connections, they were structural. By the height of the Aztec Empire in the 15th century, the island city of Tenochtitlan, home to an estimated 200,000 people, was fed primarily on corn. The spiritual dimension was equally absolute. According to the Popol Vuh, the 16th century compilation of Maya creation texts drawn from older oral tradition, the gods attempted to create human beings 3 separate times. First from mud. The people dissolved, then from wood. The wooden people could not think or feel or speak, and the gods destroyed them. The third attempt used corn dough. It worked. In Maya theology, human beings are not merely nourished by corn. They are made from it. The Aztecs held the same conviction. The feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl brought corn to humanity, and his people called themselves the children of corn. Running beneath all of this, unremarked because it was simply what you did, was nixtamalization. The oldest cooking equipment associated with the process has been dated to approximately 3,200 years ago. Dried corn kernels simmered in water made alkaline with calcium, hydroxide, or ash, rinsed, then ground into masa dough on a flat stone metate, the grinding a low, rhythmic scrape that started before dawn in every household from the Gulf Coast to the Highlands. Then the dough pressed by hand onto a clay comel over fire. The smell is mineral and warm, faintly sour, the smell of limestone meeting wet grain with the char of the comal underneath. What happens chemically is precise. The alkaline bath breaks the bond that locks niacin, vitamin B3, inside the corn kernel where it is otherwise inaccessible to the human body. It also removes the pericarp, increases calcium content by up to 400%, and neutralizes fungal toxins. Without this process, a person living primarily on corn will eventually become sick. With it, corn becomes a complete dietary staple. The tortillas pressed from masa each morning in Tenochtitlan were, in a strict nutritional sense, more complete than most of what Europe was eating at the same moment. Every major civilization in Mesoamerica knew this. Every household practiced it. It was performed in open courtyards and marketplace kitchens, in full view of anyone who passed. Then, in 1493, a ship arrived on the coast of Spain, and the men who had watched decided it was just seasoning. Christopher Columbus carried corn back to Spain in 1493, among the curiosities he presented to Ferdinand and Isabella. The grain spread with unusual speed. It was adaptable, high-yielding, easy to grow on thin soils, and ready to harvest faster than wheat. Within a century, it had moved through Europe into Africa and Asia. For the rural poor of Spain, northern Italy, southern France, and Romania, it became a staple because it was cheap. What the Spanish had left behind when they sailed home was the process. They had seen nixtamalization performed in public in every indigenous village they visited. They recorded it in correspondence when they mentioned it at all as a local habit. A flavor preference, something the people seemed to do with lime. They did not understand what they were watching. They did not ask. They boiled their corn in plain water, ground it dry, and made polenta and porridge with nutritionally sealed grain. In 1735, the Spanish court physician Gaspar Casal described a new disease he was seeing among peasants in the Asturian countryside. A bright red rash appeared on the neck and the backs of the hands, the skin areas most exposed to sun. He called it mal de la rosa, the disease of the rose. It came with diarrhea, then confusion, then, in advanced cases, death. The Italian physician Gaetano Strambio built a dedicated hospital for pellagra patients in Ferrara in 1778 and documented 3 volumes of cases. By 1832, researchers found that nearly 10% of the population of some villages in the Romanian province of Moldavia developed pellagra every spring. Theories multiplied: spoiled grain, a soil germ, bad air, hereditary weakness. In 1869, the Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso published his theory that corn itself contained a toxic substance. He was wrong. But the wrong theory dominated. Nobody during all of this period asked why communities in Mexico and Central America, who ate more corn than anyone in Europe, showed almost none of the disease. The answer was performing itself every morning in kitchens from Oaxaca to Guatemala, visible to anyone willing to look at it closely enough to ask why. Then, in the autumn of 1906, a physician in Alabama noticed something wrong with 88 patients in an asylum, and the disaster finally had a face. The disease arrived in the American South like something that had been waiting. Dr. George H. Searcy at the Mount Vernon Insane Hospital near Mobile, Alabama, documented 88 patients showing the characteristic rash in late summer of 1906. He reported his findings to his medical association the following year. Then, more cases appeared. Hundreds, then thousands. By 1912, the state of South Carolina alone was recording 30,000 cases of pellagra, with a death rate of 40%. Pellagra killed 1,306 people in South Carolina in just the first 10 months of 1915. 100,000 Southerners were affected in 1916. The patients were poor, sharecroppers, mill workers, orphans, asylum inmates who ate what the institution served, which was corn and salt pork and molasses, because that was all there was. The connection between their diet and their disease was, from a certain vantage point, obvious. But obvious was not the same as acknowledged. The medical establishment had its answer. Pellagra was infectious. The Thompson-McFadden Commission studied the mill town of Spartanburg, South Carolina, in 1912, and officially concluded the disease behaved like a communicable agent. The report was wrong, but it was authoritative, and it fit the dominant theory of the age. In 1914, the Surgeon General assigned Dr. Joseph Goldberger to investigate. He had been born in Hungary and had already made his reputation containing typhus and yellow fever outbreaks across the South. He was methodical, he was stubborn, and he was not from the South. He went to orphanages in Georgia and Mississippi, where pellagra struck the children year after year. He watched. He walked the dining halls. He noted what was on the plates: corn grits, corn syrup, salt pork, white flour. He noticed that the nurses and orderlies and kitchen staff, living in the same buildings, breathing the same air as the Pellegrin children, never got sick. If the disease were infectious, the staff would be ill. They were not. He changed the diet. Meat, eggs, milk, and beans added to the children's meals. The pellagra cleared within weeks. The response from Southern medicine and Southern politics was not gratitude. It was anger. To argue that pellagra was caused by dietary poverty was to argue that the South was too poor to properly feed its people. Several prominent physicians rejected Goldberger's evidence outright. Politicians called his findings a slander against the region. He pushed harder. In 1916, he organized what he called filth parties. He and his colleagues, including his wife Mary, deliberately swallowed capsules packed with scabs taken from Pellegrin's skin rashes. They rubbed nasal and throat secretions from pellagra patients into their own noses and mouths. 12 volunteers. None of them developed pellagra. The disease was not contagious. The proof was in their own healthy bodies. One South Carolina official later compared Goldberger to a fascist. The attacks continued for years. He spent the last 15 years of his life trying to isolate the specific missing nutrient. He never found it. He developed kidney cancer. He died on January 17, 1929, at 54 years old, with the answer still unnamed. 8 years later, the biochemist Conrad Elveyem at the University of Wisconsin isolated it. Niacin, vitamin B3, present in meat, in eggs, in green vegetables, absent in untreated corn, a vitamin. The same molecule that the Aztecs had been releasing from their corn with lime water for 3,000 years before Goldberger was born. In every kitchen, performed every morning in full public view of the Spanish, who had watched and called it flavoring. Between 1906 and 1940, more than 3 million Americans were affected by pellagra. More than 100,000 died. The answer had been in every tortilla. Nobody had looked. Once niacin was identified, the fix was simple. Food fortification programs added vitamin B3 to cornmeal and flour. The epidemic collapsed. Within a decade, pellagra had become an obscure medical footnote for most Americans, its scale barely remembered. But corn was not finished. It was only changing form. After the Second World War, American agricultural policy subsidized corn production on a massive scale. Hybrid varieties developed in the 1920s and 1930s had already pushed yields dramatically higher. Now the Corn Belt expanded. Farmers in Iowa and Illinois planted into every available acre. Storage elevators rose across the Midwest horizon. By the 1960s, surpluses were so large that the industry needed new destinations for the grain. Commercial high-fructose corn syrup production began in 1964. The chemistry had been developing since the 1950s. In the late 1960s, the Japanese biochemist Yoshiyuki Takasaki refined an enzyme that made the industrial conversion of cornstarch into fructose commercially viable. When American sugar tariffs in the late 1970s drove up the price of cane sugar, food manufacturers made the switch. Coca-Cola and Pepsi both converted their sodas from sugar to high fructose corn syrup in the early 1980s. Then the derivatives spread into everything. Modified corn starch thickened the ketchup. Corn-derived dextrose sweetened the bread. Xanthan gum held the dressing in suspension. Citric acid extended the shelf life of canned goods. Maltodextrin coated the instant coffee powder. Corn-based polylactic acid became biodegradable plastic. Ethanol from corn blended into the fuel at every gas station. Hair isotope analysis published alongside the 2007 documentary King Corn confirmed what the ingredient labels obscured. More than 50% of the carbon atoms in a typical American's body originated from corn, traveling through processed foods, sweeteners, and the flesh of corn-fed animals. The grain had reached inside the human body itself. You were consuming it in quantities you could not track, under names you did not recognize, in every meal, every day. And then came the discovery that almost nobody knows about. Today, the numbers are staggering. The world produces 1.23 billion metric tons of corn per year, a six-fold increase since 1961. The United States harvests roughly 400 million metric tons, about a third of global production. Corn occupies more than 20% of all cropland on Earth. It is the foundation of meat, of sweetener, of ethanol, of biodegradable plastic, of more than 4,000 labeled grocery products. And then, there is the fact about penicillin. In 1941, a scientist named Andrew Moyer was working at the USDA Northern Regional Research Laboratory in Peoria, Illinois, in the middle of the American Corn Belt. The British researchers Howard Florey and Norman Heatley had recently arrived in the United States carrying their Oxford penicillin, a drug that could kill bacterial infections, but existed in such small quantities it was nearly impossible to deploy at scale. They needed a way to produce it in industrial volumes. They brought their problem to Peoria. Moyer began experimenting. He tried adding corn-steep liquor to the penicillin fermentation medium. Corn-steep liquor is the thick, dark, nutrient-rich liquid produced when corn kernels are soaked in warm water during the wet milling process. It was industrial runoff. Waste. Nobody wanted it. Moyer added it to the culture. The penicillin yield increased tenfold. In one experiment, that discovery made mass production of penicillin possible. Pharmaceutical companies scaled up the fermentation process. By 1944, Allied field hospitals had enough penicillin to treat infected wounds in a way no army in the history of warfare had managed before. The antibiotic era began. Millions of lives were saved. The same crop that had killed more than 100,000 Americans because Europeans watched an indigenous processing technique and dismissed it as flavoring also produced the industrial waste that made the world's most important antibiotic. The crop that hid its nutrition from millions of poor people in the American South also hid the medicine that would eventually treat half the world. The penicillin in every hospital pharmacy on Earth was built, in part, on corn. The humble crop that secretly controls the modern world turned out to be controlling things nobody had predicted. 9,000 years ago, someone in a dry valley in southern Mexico chewed the stalk of a wild grass and tasted sweetness. They noticed a kernel that was softer than the others. They saved those seeds. Over thousands of years of patient, nameless work, they pulled an inedible weed into something the world had never seen before and could not survive without now. The Maya built their creation myth from it. The Aztecs fed 200,000 people on it. A Spanish explorer carried it across an ocean and left behind the knowledge of how to eat it safely. 2 centuries of pellagra followed, moving from Spain to Italy to Romania to the American South, killing hundreds of thousands of people whose fate had already been solved in every Mesoamerican kitchen for 3,000 years. A physician named Goldberger proved the cause and was punished for the proof. 8 years after he died, a biochemist in Wisconsin confirmed what Goldberger had nearly grasped. The epidemic ended. The grain was fortified, then industrialized, then poured into everything, then added to a fermentation vat in Peoria, and the antibiotic age began. That is a 9,000-year RCC from a wild grass in a Mexican river valley to the medicine in every hospital on Earth. It runs through the lime water on every comal in ancient Tenochtitlan. through the red rash on the hands of Italian peasants who never understood what they were missing, through the orphanages of Mississippi where children got well once someone finally fed them properly, through a barrel of industrial runoff in Illinois that nobody thought was useful until 1941. The knowledge never hid itself. It performed in public, in every village, in every kitchen, for anyone who paid attention. The people who thrived were the ones who looked. It was always there. You just didn't see it. If this one surprised you, drop a comment telling me which part landed hardest. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good moment.